This talk is about what happened in 2005 with the election for the National Assembly when Hugo Chavez's supporters won all the seats. You can see here the results of the 2000 National Assembly election. Hugo Chavez supporters are in red. And they won a little bit more than half of the seats. The opposition had 35% of the seats in the 2000 election, and you can see what happened in 2005, where the Chavez supporters essentially won all the seats because the opposition to Chavez boycotted the election. Why did this happen? Well, Hugo Chavez was reelected president of Venezuela in 2000, and he had 60% of the vote, and he was elected to a 6-year term. The National Assembly was also elected in 2000. There were 165 seats at stake. Legislators were elected to a 5-year term, so their election would be in 2005, which we're going to talk about. And in 2000, Chavez supporters won 65% of the seats. So the opposition from the years 2000 to 2005 had 35% of the seats, but they were an effective opposition. They blocked legislation that would have required a two-thirds majority. Chavez didn't have a two-thirds majority, and the opposition slowed down the legislative process. They were pretty effective legislators. Approval of a bill for Chavez took 217 days. Now, Julio Borges was a member of the National Assembly, and from 2000 to 2005, up-and-coming politician, opposition politician, well-educated, with degrees from Boston University and Oxford University, an effective, intelligent, smooth debater, and he did very well in the National Assembly, and he was leading in all the polls to be the opposition candidate for president in 2006. We had a great platform in the National Assembly for the opposition. Now, the National Electoral Council, these are the headquarter buildings for it. They run all the elections in Venezuela, and they scheduled the election for 2005 on December the 4th. And one of the important factors about this election was that they were going to use fingerprint monitors. And it was first used in 2004, and they were going to use them in the 2005 election as well. The Electoral Council announced that, and I'll talk more about those machines. Now, both the European Union and the Organization of American States monitored the election. The EU sent 160 observers, and the OAS sent 50 observers. They were watching the electoral process, making recommendations to improve it, checking for fraud, looking over everything as the process moved on. But in addition, the OAS acted as a broker of agreements during the election process. If there was a problem in getting the two sides together, the OAS would step in and broker an agreement. So in September, on September 20th, 2005, the 5 major opposition parties announced a coalition slate of candidates for the assembly elections they were going to run. And this is in September of 2005, just a few months before the election. The opposition got together and said, we're running, here's our slate of candidates. Now here's the fingerprint monitoring devices that we're talking about. Voter comes in, places a thumb on an optical scanner, and if the thumbprint basically has already been detected that day, the person is blocked from voting. It prevents double voting. But the opposition parties claim that the fingerprints could be used to identify how people voted. The Election Commission said no, that's not possible. The fingerprint machines are not linked to a voter's ballot. So there was a disagreement here, the opposition saying we don't want these fingerprint machines being used. Now here's Jorge Rodriguez. He was president of the Electoral Council at that time, and what the OAS did was they brokered an agreement between the Electoral Council and the opposition, and Rodriguez announced they were not going to use the fingerprint machines. He stood by his claim that the fingerprint scanners were not usable to identify voters. He stood by that claim, but in the interest of brokering an agreement, getting the opposition on board for the election, smoothing out the process, Rodriguez says, okay, we're not going to use those machines. Now, public opinion polls at the time showed that Chavez had an approval rating of 70%. He was extraordinarily popular, and the polls indicated that Chavez supporters were projected to win 70 to 75% of the seats, up from their 65%, and would essentially have a two-thirds majority in the National Assembly. So here's what happened on November 29th, just a few days before the election. Here's Henry Ramos Alum. He was general secretary of one of the opposition parties, and he announced that his party and three other major opposition parties would not take part in the assembly elections, and they instructed all of their candidates to withdraw. And basically, they said this was due to a lack of trust in the Electoral Council. There's just a few days before the election. And then on December 1, we're even closer to the election, Borges and his opposition party announced that they would not take part in the election. You see Borges there with other prominent opposition leaders. There's Leopoldo Lopez, and just down from them is Henry Capriles, all important opposition figures, and they cited this lack of trust in the Electoral Council as a reason for their decision, but also the party did not want to break with the other opposition parties. Other opposition parties had decided to boycott the election, and so they went along with that. All of the prominent opposition leaders are out of the election. Now, here's how the EU responded. Remember, the EU had sent a large number of observers, and what the EU said was that withdrawal took place after those parties had previously announced their participation if the Electoral Council would eliminate the fingerprint monitoring devices. And the CNE had demonstrated a clear willingness to meet the demands of the opposition to increase confidence in the process. So the EU had been involved in this process as well, and they said, we thought there was an agreement. Here's what the General Secretary of the Organization of American States said. They were directly involved in brokering the agreement. And he said that the Venezuelan opposition assured us that they would not withdraw from the electoral process. If certain conditions were met, and the conditions were met, those fingerprint monitors weren't going to be used. And even despite this, they withdrew. The OAS had a big problem with what the opposition had done. Here's what Maria Machado did. She was a director of a voting organization, and she had received a grant. Her organization had received a grant from the United States government to promote democracy in Venezuela just before, again, the election. And what she did in order to promote democracy, she urged voters not to vote in the assembly elections and to go to church instead. The election was going to be held on a Sunday, and she just said, don't go vote and stay home or go to church. The election results, only 25% of the voters turned out. It was very, very low turnout. Opposition supporters said they told us not to vote. They were boycotting the election. So they didn't turn out. Many Chavez supporters didn't vote because they knew that Chavez supporters were going to win all the seats. And torrential rains also occurred on voting day. Very low voter turnout. And the Chavez supporters, as I said, had won all of the seats. Now, Chavez went out and made an announcement. He said the United States was behind that opposition boycott. The United States was funding the opposition, giving them advice, and the advice from the United States was to boycott the election. And the reason for that was it would delegitimize the vote in face of his near certain victory for Chavez as the polls. And the United States State Department, of course, denied any involvement. Here was the press narrative that came out at the time, and you can see the press narrative supported this idea that the opposition even said the low turnout rate deprives the election of legitimacy. Well, they were one of the primary instigators of the low turnout vote. They boycotted the election, and now they claim that, well, the low turnout vote indicates it wasn't legitimate. And the New York Times reported that really the opposition's decision appeared to be appealing to international support to discredit Venezuela's government. See how low the turnout rate is. See that Chavez supporters won all the election, and that's what they were pitching the narrative that a lot of the press supported. Here's what the director of Human Rights Watch had to say about it, though. He came out and said, look, it's really hard to understand what the opposition is trying to do here. It's not going to help them present themselves as victims that deserve solidarity from the international community. They're the ones that are boycotting the election. It's their choice, and they're going to claim that they're victims when they had worked out a compromise that was acceptable, supposedly acceptable to them. It wasn't going to get anybody any support internationally. Here's what Borges had to say about it the next year. You know, he was never nominated for president. He basically gave up his visibility, his role in opposition politics for 5 years. He didn't run for his seat. He was going to get that seat. He would have been in the National Assembly for another 5 years with a great platform, but he gave it up. And you can see what he said in 2007. He said, look, I believe that we made a gigantic, extraordinarily gigantic error by just giving away all of our seats and allowing Chavez to do what he could do for the next 5 years. The Venezuela Reader has a blog, and the documents that were used to put this talk together are included in a write-up on that blog.